no, or yes, or I guess so, but they're not going to be able to articulate to you what those security requirements are. And now, so this is where we're going to differ a little bit from traditional Agile. Because we would recommend you do threat modeling and you figure it out, I think you need to figure out what the security requirements probably should be and articulate those in some kind of Agile way, like a stakeholder security story, which I'll talk about in a second. And then you go back to the customer and say, well, these are our ideas and what we think is important to you. And what do you think about them? And particularly explaining to them what is the risk that each one is trying to address. What's the cost and schedule impact going to be if you implement that? And obviously it has a significant effect on, do you already have a standard control for that? Because if you have a standard control and you go to them and say, as an example, let's say you had security logging already sort of licked, right? And so it was really simple for developers to add security events into their system. You might go to them and say, security logging is really important because you can do intrusion detection and figure out what if you've been attacked and blah, 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 blah. And the stakeholder is going to be like, I don't care about any of that. And you're like, well, yeah, but we've already built standard components, and it's in our coding guidelines on how to use it, and it's really simple for us to do, and it really won't slow us down at all, and it's really important, like the corporation thinks this is really important. Then your boss or your stakeholder is going to be like, all right, I don't care, as long as it doesn't cost me money, I'll take it. Now, not everything's going to be that easy, is that you can get security for free, and clearly if you don't have a standard component, it's not going to be for free. And even if you do, it's going to take work to figure it out. So as an example, access control. Access control is probably something you need, but it takes work to figure out what the policy is. And when you go to the customer and you bug them about policy, they're like, I don't have time to figure this out. I want to see the functionality, see what I like it. I don't want to figure out a policy for a piece of functionality that I might throw away. Oh, well, that makes perfect sense. Let's defer that to later on. So let's know that we need access control, but let's defer that, figuring in that detail out till later. Now, you might want to build access control into your system, though, so that when you figure it out later, you don't have to like re-architect your whole application to enforce it. So you might be able to figure out a way to put access control checks in your code when you build it, but initially it's always yes, you can access it, yes, you can access it, so you can build the functionality quickly, get it worked out, and then once the functionality stabilizes, then you can figure out what the policy is for that. So here, this is a little bit different from Agile in the traditional sense. You're suggesting to the client functionality. I mean, you probably are doing it anyway, but I mean, I really think it's a little bit stronger. You're like, no, this is really important. They need to understand the risks that it addresses and the costs, and I think that's important. And then, of course, you would go through these standard confidentiality, integrity, availability questions, of course, to help you, because you can't tell them all the security they need, because they own the system. So you can tell them some things. Like, for example, some things like cross-site scripting, for example, that's pretty much something you just tell them. You say, like, there's this thing called cross-site scripting. You can do evil and bad stuff with it. Maybe we have standard components to avoid it. It's probably important. We got to do it. But there's not a lot of input for them to you on that particular topic. But for confidentiality or integrity and availability, it's hugely important. Like availability, okay, how much uptime do you need? You need 3 nines, or it can be down a day a month, or an hour a month, or whatever. That comes from them. And then once you get their high-level needs in this area, you can adjust your security requirements to say, okay, well, to provide that level of confidentiality, integrity, or what have you, then here's the components or the controls I need, and these are the stories that we're going to describe that describe those controls, and here's the cost and schedule impacts of those things relative to the other things that we're trying to build. And you obviously have to take risk into account as well. So to do this threat modeling, there is a threat modeling process, at least at a high level process and a risk rating process that Aspect has put together, and we made it available at Owasp, at the Owasp risk rating methodology. It just basically helps you structure your thoughts on, what are the assets I'm trying to protecting, what are the components, what's the path through the system, what are the threat agents, et cetera, and try to find the risks and rank those risks as to which ones are most important. So just one way of at least starting some basic threat modeling, there's some guidance at Owasp on how to do that. So when you're capturing these risks and you're trying to explain them to your client, the stakeholder, we want to do it in as agile way as we can so everyone involved is doing something that they're familiar with. So we're proposing that you do stakeholder security stories, just like you do regular user stories. So these security stories are written in as positive way as you can about what you're trying to achieve. So there's, in fact, if you look at security in general, there's a lot of it that's functional security, right? Authentication, authorization, security logging, things like that. Now, a number of authentication security mechanisms are more of defensive in nature and don't naturally lend themselves to being sort of positive things, but are more of purely defensive things. They're still features, but they're security features that don't clearly add value to your client, except that they reduce risk that they may or may not be concerned of. So other people have proposed that you write abuser stories. Johan Peters, for example, and some other people, right? And so there's different approaches to dealing with this. It's our opinion that you probably can write them all as positive statements in this way. And if you can, that's clearly what I would recommend. Because the more it's like what you're used to doing already, the more natural it's going to be for the stakeholders, more natural for the developers. Whereas if you're writing negative statements, that doesn't sound like a user story and some functionality I got to build. But there's still, I think trying both of these out and seeing what makes sense in your organization makes sense. We believe that this is probably the more natural way for your organization to do it. And I can also imagine a situation where you're writing most of these stakeholder security stories in a positive way, and there's just a few hard ones that you can't figure out how to make them positive, so you create an abuser story. But I would rather not go there until I'm forced to go there and someone convinces me that I have to do it that way. And we're not convinced that has to happen that way. Now, so, okay, that's it. So the idea is you go across this process, you're going to be weaving security throughout your sprints. And so there's a number of ways you can do it. You can weave it into every single sprint along the way, a little bit of security, as necessary. Or you could sort of queue it up and do a whole sprint on security, or do a combination of both. But it really should all be based on your prioritization scheme. That's what Agile is about, is focusing on what's most important next. In other words, the most functionality you can build in the next 3 weeks, right? And that's the most important functionality, right? So that should drive your prioritization scheme. So however if a little bit of security happens along the way, or you have a big security phase because doing all the security things together in one sprint is more effective and more efficient because of the interrelationships, that's up to you to decide in terms of priority. So if you're following the Agile model, then you're going to develop your test cases for this security functionality, and then you're going to build these security components, and then you're going to integrate them into your environment, and then you're going to build more test cases to verify that your product, your software uses those security mechanisms correctly. Now, clearly, building security components is a big, expensive thing. And it's probably not something you're going to be able to easily do in a typical Agile sprint, depending on how sophisticated the component is, right? So you might be able to build little pieces and get it more fancy over time, right? So maybe you can build login first, and then the next